Welcome back to Drowsy History, or if this is your first time here, welcome. I am genuinely glad you found your way to this particular corner of the internet. Go ahead and settle in now, wherever you are. Pull the blanket a little higher. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop just a little, and notice the weight of your own limbs against whatever is underneath you. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do for the next little while. The world outside can keep going without you for a few hours, and if you get the chance, before you fall asleep, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. It genuinely fascinates me how far these videos reach, and I read every single one. A quiet subscribe to, if you feel so inclined, means the channel keeps growing and more slow histories keep finding their way to people who need them. Tonight's story is a long one, and a dark one, and a strange one, and it is set, as so many good, strange, dark stories are, in the England of the Tudors. We are going to spend a quiet, unhurried evening in the company of a particular kind of man. Not a king, not a courtier, not an archbishop or an admiral or any of the famous people whose names fill the history books and whose faces have been painted and preserved. We are going to sit down instead with the executioner, the man who stood at the scaffold, the man who held the axe, the man whose name was sometimes known to the whole of London, and whose face could empty a tavern the moment he walked in, and also the man who was, despite all of this, simply trying to make a living, get through the week, go home at night, and sleep. We are going to ask, in the most serious and unhurried way possible, what his life was actually like. Not the dramatic moment of the swing, the rest of it. The whole weight of an ordinary life lived in the shadow of an extraordinary profession. What did he eat for breakfast? How did he sleep? Who were his friends? And did he have any worth the name? How did he feel about his work? And did he feel anything at all? And how would we know? What did it cost him? Not in coin, though we will talk about coin too, but in the other currencies that a life is spent in. The social ones, the spiritual ones, the ones that don't have a name, but that you feel in the chest on a quiet evening when the fire is low and the house is still. There is no quiz at the end of this. You do not need to remember anything. You do not even need to stay awake, and in fact, I would rather you didn't. The story will still be here in the morning, quiet and patient, exactly where you left it. So close your eyes whenever you're ready, and let's go back to Tudor England together. Picture England in the 16th century. Not the England of glossy period dramas, where the costumes are perfect and the lighting flatters everyone, and the dialogue is crisp and clever, and the protagonists are all beautiful people with interesting problems. The real England. The England of open sewers, running down the middle of cobblestone streets, of houses so close together that neighbors on opposite sides of an alley could lean from their upper windows and nearly shake hands, of flea-ridden rushes strewn across even the floors of reasonably prosperous households, of a life expectancy that made 50 years old seem like a reasonable innings. The England of pigs rooting through the middens behind houses, of apprentices sleeping three to a bed, of women who had buried as many children as they had raised, of men whose bodies were old at 40 from the work those bodies had been asked to do. It was also an England defined, with peculiar intensity, by the scaffold. 5 monarchs in a single century: Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, Elizabeth I, each bringing their own theological convictions, their own political paranoia, their own particular roster of enemies, traitors, heretics, and inconveniences, all of whom needed at various intervals to be publicly and permanently removed from the world. The Tudor century was not the most violent period in English history. The medieval centuries that preceded it were arguably bloodier in absolute terms, and the century that followed, with its civil wars, would have something to say on the subject. But it was a period in which state violence was exercised with a particular theatrical deliberateness, in which the scaffold was a stage, and the condemned were, in some important sense, performing their deaths for an audience that the state had assembled. The death penalty in Tudor England was applied with an enthusiasm that would be unrecognizable to a modern citizen. You could be hanged for theft of goods worth more than a shilling. You could be hanged for cutting down a young tree from an orchard. You could be burned alive for holding the wrong theological opinions about what happened to the bread and wine during Holy Communion, a question that most people today would classify as a minor doctrinal disagreement, and that Tudor society classified as a matter of life and death, often literally. You could be beheaded for high treason, which was a charge elastic enough to cover everything from actually plotting to overthrow the king, to casting horoscopes about his death, to writing a letter that someone with enough political motivation could read as seditious, to simply being related to the wrong person at the wrong moment in the wrong dynastic conflict. And you could be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most elaborate and harrowing execution method in the English legal arsenal, for treasons of the most serious kind, a sentence that involved being dragged through the streets on a hurdle, hanged until nearly dead, cut down while still living, disemboweled, emasculated if male, beheaded, and finally divided into 4 parts, each part to be sent to a different location for display. That sentence was not theoretical. It was carried out regularly on real human beings, in public, before large crowds that had come specifically to watch it. In that world, someone had to do the cutting, someone had to do the hanging, someone had to manage the logistics of death as a civic institution, week in and week out, with the same professional regularity as the blacksmith shoeing horses, or the baker producing loaves, or the chandler making candles for the night. That someone was the executioner. He was not a monster, usually. He was a working man. He had a job to do. And that job, as we are about to discover in considerable detail, was one of the most thoroughly uncomfortable, professionally precarious, socially bizarre, and psychologically demanding occupations in Tudor England. He was necessary, and he was reviled in almost equal measure by the same society that could not do without him. He was well paid by the standards of his era, and barely employed in the sense that any craftsman would recognize. He was given a title: the hangman, the headsman, the common executioner, and simultaneously denied most of the social goods that a title was supposed to confer. He occupied, in other words, a position with no real parallel in the modern world, and understanding it requires us to spend some time in a social landscape whose assumptions and values were very different from our own. Let's begin. The first thing to understand about becoming a Tudor executioner is that it was rarely a career anyone planned. In the 21st century, we have a habit of imagining that historical professions worked something like modern ones. You identify a field, you acquire training, you apply for a position, you negotiate terms, you start work. The reality of how men came to stand on Tudor scaffolds was considerably stranger and more haphazard than that, and the roots into the profession tell us something important about what the profession was and what it meant to take it up. The most common route into the job, by a significant margin, was through the judicial system itself, as a victim of it, rather than an administrator. In many English jurisdictions throughout the Tudor period, a condemned man facing death could at the last possible moment offer to serve as the town's executioner in exchange for a royal pardon. This practice, known informally as turning the tables, was well established by the time the Tudors came to power and continued through the whole of the 16th century and beyond. The logic was simple and entirely unsentimental. The town needed someone to do the work, the condemned man needed to live, and the transaction was efficient, if uncomfortable for everyone involved. The man who yesterday stood on the scaffold, expecting to die, would tomorrow stand on the same scaffold in an entirely different capacity, and the crowd that had come to watch him hang would watch instead as he hanged someone else. The irony was not lost on anyone. It was, in fact, part of the point. The spectacle of the condemned becoming the executioner reinforced, in a single person and a single transformation, the lesson about justice and its instruments that the scaffold was always meant to convey. The social and psychological implications of this arrangement were considerable and almost entirely unremarked upon by contemporary sources, which tells us something about how contemporary sources regarded the inner life of men in the executioner's position. The new executioner, saved from death by accepting the role, was not exactly free. He had traded one trap for another. He was now, in most cases, required to remain in the jurisdiction that had pardoned him, available for work whenever the court required him, bound to his new profession whether it suited him or not, for as long as that profession required him. He had, in exchange for his life, given up the options of being anything other than what he had just agreed to become. And what he had agreed to become was a man whom his neighbors regarded with a mixture of fear, disgust, and uneasy gratitude that varied by individual but was never entirely absent, as someone who stood outside the normal compass of human society, a man apart, a man who had, in some sense, already crossed a threshold that other people spent their whole lives hoping not to cross. There were other routes, of course. Some men came from families that had practiced the trade. There are records of sons following fathers into the executioner's role in cities large enough to support a permanent, salaried post, and the Brandons, the most documented London executioner family of the later Tudor and Stuart period, suggest that this kind of hereditary continuation was possible. Some were appointed directly by civic authorities who had the post to fill and made the best appointment available from among the men who had not already made other arrangements for their lives. Some came from related occupations, the knackers who slaughtered horses for a living, the butchers who had skill with heavy blades, the men who worked in slaughterhouses and had developed, perhaps through long practice, a professional relationship with the ending of animal life that made the authorities think they might manage the ending of human life without falling to pieces. Some were soldiers returned from wars, men who had done violence in a military context, and who were thought to have passed through some threshold that made official civic violence a lesser imposition. Some were simply men in desperate circumstances who needed money and a pardon for previous offenses, and who were prepared to do whatever was required to get both. What almost no one was, in any well documented case, was eager in the way that later mythology would sometimes suggest. The executioner as a figure drawn to his work by dark personal appetite, who relished the power of it, who chose it because something in his nature required it. This is largely a literary and theatrical invention, developed well after the Tudor period itself, that tells us far more about how later ages wanted to understand the executioner than about what actual Tudor executioners were like as people. The records that survive suggest instead men who did a difficult and demanding job as professionally as they could manage, and who generally suffered for it in ways that their society preferred not to acknowledge. They were not volunteers for something terrible. They were, in the main, people for whom terrible had become ordinary, as it does for anyone who does the same difficult thing long enough. The number of available posts was not large. England in the Tudor period did not have a national network of professional executioners, the way that France, for instance, developed with its system of hereditary bourreau families in the 17th and 18th centuries, or the way that Germany maintained its separate caste of Scharfrichter with formal training and recognized professional standing. Instead, each major town or county typically had one man who held the position of common executioner, sometimes also titled the hangman. London, as the largest city in England and the seat of government, had the most active and the most famous such post. Its holder was expected to handle not only ordinary criminal executions at the city gallows, but also the high profile judicial killings, the beheadings of traitors and nobility at Tower Hill and Tower Green, that were such a feature of Tudor political life. Outside London, the picture was patchier and more improvised. Some towns had a permanent executioner on the civic payroll, a salaried position that provided a minimal income and a defined role. Others hired in for specific occasions, putting out a call when an execution was scheduled and paying a day rate to whoever was willing and available and competent. Others relied on a system in which the sheriff or the county were responsible for finding someone when needed, which meant that in practice, the condemned man's offer to take the job himself was often accepted not out of any particular system or preference, but simply because there was genuinely no one else. The irregular and improvisational nature of employment was one of the defining features of the executioner's working life throughout the Tudor period, and we will return to it at considerable length. For now, the key point is simply this: becoming an executioner in Tudor England was rarely a choice made freely. It was most commonly the last resort of desperate men, made in circumstances that left very little room for the word choice to mean anything at all. And having made it, those men found themselves in a position that their society had not designed well, had not thought through carefully, and had very little interest in improving. Let us talk now about the work itself before we talk about what it cost the man who did it. Because in order to understand the peculiar difficulties of the Tudor executioner's position, You need to understand exactly what he was being asked to do, and how many different things that actually encompassed, and how much skill each of those things required, and how publicly that skill would be evaluated by people who had no idea how to do it themselves. The most common form of judicial execution in Tudor England was hanging, and the most common venue for hanging in London was Tyburn. Tyburn stood at the northeast corner of what is now Hyde Park, roughly where the Marble Arch stands today, and it was the city's primary place of public execution for several centuries. The Tyburn Gallows, in the most recognizable version of its structure during the Tudor period and after, was a triangular frame called the triple tree or the Tyburn tree, capable of hanging multiple condemned simultaneously. On a hanging day at Tyburn, which occurred 8 times a year on the sessions days and was known as a Tyburn Fair, the city emptied itself of working people who wanted to watch. Apprentices abandoned their masters and accepted the fines that came with it. Shopkeepers shuttered their windows and joined the procession. Street sellers set up along the route, selling pies, ale, and broadsides printed with the condemned person's last words and confession, whether or not those words and that confession had actually been given. The road from Newgate Prison to Tyburn, a route of roughly 3 miles through the streets of London, was lined with spectators for the entire length of the journey, which took several hours because the cart stopped at certain taverns along the way, a tradition that gave the condemned a final drink and gave the crowd a chance to interact with the person they were shortly to watch die. The executioner's work on a hanging day began well before the crowd arrived, or at least the visible crowd, because the invisible crowd of the morning's preparation was its own kind of audience. He received the condemned from the prison, confirmed the documentation, the death warrant authorizing the execution had to be in order, because carrying out a hanging without proper paperwork was not merely an administrative irregularity, but could constitute unlawful killing, and the executioner, not the court that had issued the sentence, would be the one physically responsible and prepared the apparatus. The rope had to be selected and tested. The knot had to be tied correctly, which in this period was a more complex judgment than it might sound, because the knot's placement and tightness determined not just whether the condemned died, but how and how quickly. Here it is worth pausing, because the mechanics of Tudor hanging are not what most people now imagine. The long drop method of hanging, in which the condemned falls a calculated distance to break the neck cleanly and cause death rapidly, was not invented until the late 18th century and was not standardized until the 19th. Tudor hanging was a strangulation. The condemned was placed in or on a cart with the rope around his neck. The cart was driven away, and the body was left to hang, strangling slowly, sometimes for several minutes, and sometimes for considerably longer than that. The physiological process was not quick and was not painless, and the crowd watching it could see perfectly well that it was neither. In many cases, the executioner or his assistants were expected to pull on the legs of the hanging man to hasten death, a task that required direct physical contact with a person who was actively dying, who was sometimes still moving, whose face was undergoing the changes that asphyxiation produces, and who might, in some cases, still be capable of something approximating awareness. For those condemned to beheading, overwhelmingly in the Tudor period, members of the nobility or those convicted of the highest treasons against the state. The tools and techniques were different, and in some ways considerably more demanding of precision. Beheading was carried out with an axe on a chopping block and was considered in the hierarchy of Tudor executions a merciful death, the privilege of rank, available even at the end, a concession to the idea that even a traitor had once been a person of consequence. The condemned knelt before the block, stretched out their neck across it, and the executioner was expected to take the head with a single clean blow. The entire ceremony had a formal, almost liturgical quality. The condemned forgave the executioner, who traditionally knelt and asked forgiveness in return. Prayers were said. The condemned arranged themselves carefully, and then the axe fell. When it worked as it was supposed to, the death was rapid, and the spectacle, while gruesome, had a kind of terrible efficiency about it. When it did not work as it was supposed to, the consequences were, as we shall see, something considerably worse. The axe itself was a tool that required maintenance, skill to use well, and a certain physical quality of the man wielding it that was not entirely within his control. It had to be kept sharp, which required regular work. A dull axe did not cut cleanly, but rather crushed and tore, a distinction that matters enormously when the thing being cut is a human neck. It had to be wielded with considerable force, applied precisely, which required both strength and the kind of controlled accuracy that came only with practice. The executioner did not have the luxury of many practice swings at a target that resembled what he would actually cut. The geometry of the thing, the angle of the blow, the positioning of the condemned's neck on the block, the executioner's own stance and grip, had to be right every time in front of a crowd that would notice instantly if it was not. For treason of the highest order, the sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering, the executioner's role was genuinely harrowing in a way that even the other difficult parts of the job did not quite match. The condemned was hanged until nearly but not quite dead, then cut down while still living, and subjected to the process of drawing, the opening of the abdomen, the removal of the entrails and the genitals, the burning of these organs in a brazier on the scaffold, while the person to whom they had belonged was at least at the beginning still alive and potentially still capable of sensation. Then came the beheading. Then the division of the body into 4 quarters, typically achieved with an axe or a heavy cleaver, each quarter then to be sent to a different location, the gates of different cities, the spikes of London Bridge, as a public warning to anyone tempted to follow the same path. The entire process, from the moment the condemned was cut down from the gallows to the moment the last quarter was separated, could take the better part of an hour, and was conducted on a public scaffold before a watching crowd that could number in the thousands. The executioner was the principal agent of all of this. He was not alone on the scaffold. There were assistants, and the sheriff's men were present for crowd control, and a priest or chaplain often attended the condemned, but the work was his. The skill required was genuine. The consequences of incompetence were immediate, public, and lasting, and the pressure of performing this work well under conditions of maximum public scrutiny before hundreds or thousands of witnesses who had come specifically to watch was a form of professional stress with very few modern equivalents. A surgeon operating in front of a medical school is perhaps the closest analogy, but even that falls short in important ways. The surgeon's patient consented to the surgery. The surgeon's goal is preservation rather than ending, and the medical school does not jeer or throw things. Beyond the headline executions, the executioner was responsible for a variety of other punishments that fell short of death but were no less central to his professional role. Flogging, which in its public form meant whipping the condemned at a cart's tail through the streets while the crowd gathered to watch, required the executioner to apply a specific and calibrated level of force, enough to fulfill the sentence, not enough to kill, and carefully judged enough that observers could see the punishment being properly administered. A flogging that went too lightly would be read as favoritism or corruption, and in a public culture, as sensitive to the proper administration of justice as Tudor England's. Such a perception had real consequences. A flogging that was too severe could kill, which was not the sentence, and would require explaining to the court that had issued it. Branding required similar precision in a different register. The hot iron had to be applied to the correct location, typically the cheek or the thumb, depending on the offense, with enough pressure and long enough contact to leave a permanent, legible mark, but not so much force that the iron penetrated through the skin and into bone or cartilage. The whole point of branding as a punishment was the permanence and legibility of the mark. A branded man or woman carried their conviction on their body for the rest of their life, visible to anyone who looked closely enough, telling the world what they had done and that they had been caught. An illegible or poorly placed brand defeated the entire purpose of the exercise and reflected on the competence of the man who had done it. The pillory required crowd management as well as technical administration. The stocks had to be properly fitted to prevent the condemned from injuring themselves or escaping, and the duration of the exposure had to be supervised. The executioner was also, in many cases, present as a kind of guarantee of order, his proximity discouraging the more enthusiastic members of the crowd from taking their participation in the punishment further than the law sanctioned. All of this, taken together, was a body of professional knowledge that was genuine, hard-won, and entirely undocumented. There were no manuals. There were no apprenticeships in any formal sense. There was no guild, no professional association, no examination, no certification. What knowledge there was passed from man to man through observation and practice, and the man who was learning did so under the most unforgiving possible conditions, in public, on the scaffold, with thousands of people watching and no one offering help. Now we must talk about money, because money is essential to understanding both the apparent attractions of the executioner's post and its many discontents, and also because the financial arrangements around Tudor execution are considerably stranger and more morally complicated than most people expect. In London, the position of common hangman came with a small but real salary paid by the city's civic authorities. By the mid-16th century, this salary was in the region of a few pounds per year, an amount that placed the holder somewhere in the lower middle of London's economic spectrum, above the desperate poor, but well below the comfortable artisan class. It was enough to survive on, barely, in the way that barely means, when it means having a roof over your head and food on the table and not very much else. The salary needed to be supplemented by the various fees and perquisites that attached to the office. And here is where things become genuinely strange, because those fees and perquisites were themselves deeply socially loaded in ways that no ordinary tradesman's supplementary income would have been. The most significant additional income came from the condemned themselves and from their families. A condemned man facing death had very strong reasons to want that death to be as swift and painless as possible. A condemned man's family had equally strong reasons to want the same, and additionally had reasons to want the body treated with dignity afterward. And the person who controlled the manner and quality of the death, the skill with which the axe fell or did not fall, the knot by which the rope was tied, the degree of care taken throughout the process, was the executioner. The result was a well established tradition in which the condemned or their representatives paid the executioner in advance for a good death. A nobleman facing beheading might pay a substantial sum for the personal assurance of a clean, single blow. A man facing hanging might pay for a specific kind of knot that would hasten the end. A family might pay to ensure that the body was treated with care and respect after death, rather than being subjected to the various legitimate indignities that the executioner was otherwise within his rights to inflict. This system was, in a very practical sense, a form of legalized extortion, and it is worth being plain about that even though no contemporary source would have put it in those terms. The executioner possessed something, the quality of the death, that the condemned desperately wanted to purchase, and the condemned had absolutely no leverage in the transaction. They could pay whatever was asked or take their chances. There was no contract, no regulation, no oversight, no recourse. Whether any individual executioner actually calibrated his performance based on payment is a question the surviving records do not clearly answer. What is certain is that the payments were made consistently across the entire period, and that they were accepted by executioners as a normal and expected part of their income. When Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, was executed on Tower Green in May 1536, she reportedly paid the swordsman brought from France for the occasion, beheading by sword rather than axe being considered a particular mercy, a sum intended to ensure his skill and attention. The gesture was real, the payment was accepted, and whether it materially changed the quality of the outcome or simply acknowledged a professional relationship both parties understood, it was a transaction conducted in full awareness of the power the executioner held. Beyond payments from the condemned, the executioner had recognized rights to various perquisites that accrued from the execution itself. He was entitled to the clothes of the condemned, a right that sounds trivial, and in some cases genuinely was trivial, since a man hanged at Tyburn in his threadbare working clothes left very little worth having. In other cases, it was far from trivial. A nobleman executed in good wool and fine linen and well-made leather left clothes that could be sold for real money, and a high-profile execution in a period when good cloth was expensive and scarce could represent a week's wages in material alone. He was also entitled to the rope from a hanging, and here is something that surprises most modern people. Hangman's rope was a commodity with genuine market value. The rope from an execution had in the popular imagination and popular practice of the period magical and medicinal properties that made it worth purchasing. A piece of hangman's rope tied around the head was supposed to cure headaches and migraines. It could ward off evil. It could bring luck in specific endeavors. Pieces of it were sought by gamblers, by sick people, by women hoping for a specific outcome in love or childbirth, by men seeking protection in legal proceedings. The trade was brisk, and a prolific executioner working regularly in a large city could supplement his income meaningfully through rope sales, cutting a single rope into many pieces and selling each piece separately to the crowds that gathered outside his lodgings after a hanging day. The body itself, in certain circumstances, was also a potential source of income, though one that came with its own complicated moral and legal dimensions. The bodies of executed criminals occupied an unusual legal space. They were, in many cases, neither fully the property of the condemned person's family, nor fully the property of the state. The executioner, who had physical possession of the body in the period immediately after execution, was in a position to facilitate or negotiate various arrangements concerning it. Arrangements with surgeons who needed bodies for anatomical study, arrangements with families seeking to bury their dead with more dignity than the usual disposal of executed criminals permitted, arrangements of other kinds that the records do not always specify, but that the general pattern of the period makes imaginable. This aspect of the executioner's economic life would become much more fully documented in later centuries, particularly around the body snatching culture of the 18th and early 19th centuries. In the Tudor period, it was less systematic, but the general principle that the executioner's proximity to the body gave him a kind of informal economic authority over its disposition was real. What all of this meant, in practice, was that the executioner's income was real, but wildly and chronically irregular. On a busy month, when multiple executions were scheduled, and the condemned were wealthy enough to pay well, and the crowds were large enough to support robust rope sales, and the perquisites were good, he could earn a meaningful sum. On a quiet month, and many months were quiet, because executions did not happen on a predictable or controllable schedule, he might earn almost nothing on top of his base salary, which was itself insufficient for comfortable living. The uncertainty was chronic and structural. He had no savings mechanism, no pension, no insurance against illness or injury that might prevent him from working, no mechanism for evening out the feast and famine cycle of a profession whose demand was entirely outside his control, generated by the workings of the legal system and the health of the king's political relationships, neither of which he had any influence over whatsoever. There was also the question of expenses. The executioner was, in most cases, expected to provide his own tools and maintain them. The axe was his, the rope was his. A new rope for each major execution was sometimes purchased at his own cost. If he wore a specific costume for the work, and some did, the tradition of masked or hooded executioners having some currency in various periods and contexts, the costume was his. He had to maintain and replace equipment regularly, keep the axe sharp and the edge true through repeated use and resharpening, purchase new ropes when old ones had been cut up and sold as magical relics or had simply worn out. None of this cost was reimbursed. It came out of the income that was already uncertain and irregular, leaving a man who might have had a good month last month and a bad month this month, and no way of knowing what next month would bring. Here we arrive at one of the most practically significant and least discussed difficulties of the Tudor executioner's daily life, which is the deceptively simple problem of finding a home and keeping it. Every person needs to live somewhere. This was not a negotiable requirement. The executioner was a human being with a body that required shelter, warmth, a place to store his things, and cook his food and sleep. In a typical English town or city of the Tudor period, accommodating this requirement would have been arranged in any number of ordinary ways: renting a room or a house from a landlord, lodging with a family in exchange for work or money, slowly building or accumulating a modest property over years as circumstances permitted. For almost everyone in Tudor England, one of these arrangements could be made without unusual difficulty. For the executioner, every option came with a specific and persistent complication. Nobody wanted to live next to him. The reluctance was not merely social snobbery, though it was certainly that as well. It was also rooted in a set of beliefs about spiritual contamination and the transmission of dangerous qualities through proximity that were entirely real and seriously held in the Tudor period, and that are easy to condescend to from a position of comfortable modern rationalism, but that made perfect sense within the cosmological framework of a society that believed, with total sincerity, in the reality of spiritual forces, malevolent presences, and the capacity of certain objects and certain people to carry those forces with them like an invisible contagion. The tools of the executioner's trade were not merely instruments. They were objects that had been used in the ending of human lives repeatedly, and that therefore carried, in the understanding of the people around them, the spiritual weight of those deaths. A rope that had hanged a man was a magical object in both directions. It could heal and protect, as we discussed, but it could also contaminate and harm when improperly handled or when its presence was unwanted. An axe that had taken heads was a thing of dread, associated with the most final and irreversible act one person could perform upon another. And living in a house where such objects were kept was living in a house with a particular kind of shadow over it. The executioner's neighbors, whether they articulated this or not, did not want that shadow falling across their own properties, their own children, their own livestock, their own spiritual landscape. The result was that executioners in Tudor England tended to end up in specific kinds of dwellings that reflected their social position with some accuracy. Properties on the margins of the city or town, in areas that other more respectable tradespeople had already decided against. Lodgings in establishments that were themselves marginal, taverns with bad reputations, houses near the gallows or near the prisons, the lower and less desirable ends of whatever neighborhood contained the civic infrastructure of punishment and justice. There are records of London executioners living near Tower Hill, not in any of the comfortable addresses the area also contained, but in the meaner lodgings close to the work, where their presence was simply a known fact of the neighborhood rather than a surprise that needed managing. There are records of executioners in provincial towns being housed at civic expense in specific dwellings maintained for the purpose, a tied cottage that came with the position, a roof in exchange for availability, which solved the immediate housing problem but made his status visible in the most permanent possible way. The house, known locally as the executioner's house, was as legible a social marker as the gallows itself. A tied executioner's cottage had a certain practical honesty about it. It acknowledged what was actually the case, that this man's position in the community was not like other men's positions, and that his housing would reflect this reality. But it also meant that he was institutionalized in the most literal sense. His home was provided by the same authority that employed him, leaving him with no independence, no assets, and no security. If he fell out with the civic authorities, or if a new administration took over with different priorities, or if the post was restructured, he lost his job and his home at the same moment, with no warning and no recourse. He owned nothing. Everything he had was contingent on his continued service and on the goodwill of the men who had hired him, and the history of Tudor civic governance is not a history of men who were notably reliable in their goodwill toward people below them on the social scale. The landlord problem for those not in tied housing was a recurring feature of the executioner's life, documented in various forms across the whole of the period and beyond. Landlords who discovered their tenant's profession or who came under pressure from other tenants who threatened to leave if the executioner stayed turned him out of lodgings with whatever notice they felt they could defend legally. There are documented cases of executioners' properties being vandalized, windows broken, doors marked with symbols whose meaning was unmistakable. There are cases of executioners who manage through careful discretion and the natural human tendency to prefer comfortable ignorance to inconvenient knowledge, to maintain lodgings in relatively ordinary neighborhoods for years, their profession an open secret that their neighbors collectively chose not to acknowledge because acknowledging it would require either acting on the knowledge or admitting they were choosing not to, and neither option was comfortable. The executioner's household, where he had one, extended the stigma beyond his own person. A wife who had married an executioner, whether she had known what she was marrying or whether the information emerged afterward, which happened, had married into his social position entirely. The contamination, as his community understood it, spread through the family. The wife of the executioner was treated with the same mixture of wariness and avoidance that attached to the man himself, simply by association, by the fact of sharing a roof and a bed. Children born into an executioner's family would find their parentage a disadvantage at almost every turn. In the selection of schoolmates, in the taking of apprenticeships, in the navigation of the marriage market that would determine the shape of their adult lives. A young woman whose father was the common hangman could expect to have her prospects of a good marriage significantly reduced by that single fact. A young man in the same position would find certain trades and certain social circles closed to him through accumulated social pressure rather than formal prohibition, which is often more effective than formal prohibition at keeping people in their assigned places. We cannot talk honestly about the life of a Tudor executioner without spending significant time on the question of religion, because Tudor England was not merely a society in which religion was important. It was a society in which religion was everything, the frame through which all other experience was understood, the institution through which social life was organized, the lens through which questions of right and wrong were filtered, and the system by which the passage through death was managed and understood. The theological status of the soul mattered in ways that shaped daily life, social relationships, access to community institutions, and the prospect of death at every level of society without exception. And the executioner occupied an uncomfortable position in relation to almost every one of those theological questions, often without any clear guidance or support. The most fundamental question was simple and alarming. Did the executioner sin by killing? The Church's position on this was not as clear as the authorities might have wished. The Catholic position, broadly, held that lawful execution carried out by authorized civil authority was not sinful. This was the tradition that ran back through Aquinas to Augustine, and it had been the dominant view throughout the medieval centuries. The executioner was not a murderer. He was an instrument of justice, acting under the authority of the crown, which derived its authority from God, and his act was therefore not only permissible, but in a certain theological light, a religious duty, an act of service to the divinely ordered structure of society. A man executed for his crimes had in this reading died justly, and the man who carried out the execution had performed a service to the order God had ordained. But complications multiplied. The Protestant Reformation that tore through England under Henry VIII and his successors did not change the basic position on the lawfulness of execution. Protestant theologians following Luther and Calvin were generally as robust as their Catholic predecessors in endorsing the civil power's right to execute criminals. What the Reformation did change in England was the specific religious landscape in which the executioner worked. Suddenly, the theological status of the people he was executing became intensely contested in ways that had not previously been the case. Under Henry VIII in the early years, the men and women burned for heresy were Catholics who rejected the royal supremacy and refused to acknowledge the king's position as head of the church. In the later years, the men and women burned for heresy were Protestants who had gone further in the reforming direction than the king was comfortable with. Under Edward VI, the executions were mostly of conservatives who clung to Catholic practice. Under Mary, the executions were of Protestants. Nearly 300 of them burned alive in under 4 years, a campaign that would define Mary's entire historical reputation and that placed the executioner in the position of killing people who were dying, in their own understanding and in the understanding of large parts of the population watching, as martyrs and saints. For a man with any genuine religious sensibility, and the evidence suggests that most executioners, whatever else they were not theologically indifferent, because no one in Tudor England was theologically indifferent. It was not an option the culture offered. This was a genuine and grinding spiritual difficulty. The Protestant martyrs burned under Mary died singing, praying, calling on God in language their own tradition recognized as the language of authentic faith, forgiving the people who were killing them, exhibiting exactly the kind of steadfastness under torture and death that Christian tradition, across its many fractures, associated with genuine martyrdom. If they were right, if they were genuinely dying for the true faith, then the man who lit the faggots or held the torch to the pyre was participating in an act that no civil warrant could sanctify. He was doing something that his own religious conscience, whatever it was, might tell him was not merely a job, but a sin of the first order. And then the regime would change, as it did dramatically when Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, and the men and women he had burned would be retrospectively honored as heroes of the English Reformation, and the acts he had carried out in good faith under proper legal warrant would be written into the national narrative as atrocities, all without him having had any control over any of it, without him having been asked. The executioner's relationship with the church was difficult in practical terms as well. Church attendance was legally required in Tudor England. The recusancy laws made failure to attend one's parish church a punishable offense, and those laws were enforced with varying levels of rigor but consistent enough effectiveness that most people attended. The executioner was therefore expected to participate in the rhythms of parish life that structured the social year, to attend, to sit in his pew, to receive the sacraments, to be present at the communal observances that were simultaneously religious requirements and social occasions. This placed him in regular, unavoidable proximity to his neighbors, in a setting specifically designed to affirm communal belonging, which was precisely the communal belonging that was systematically denied to him in every other setting. Whether churches in Tudor England required executioners to sit in specific, separated locations, as happened in some periods and places where marginalized figures were physically segregated within the church building itself, is not uniformly documented. What is documented is the general social dynamic. The executioner, as a person who must be accommodated within the community's religious life, while being kept, at some level, at arm's length from its full benefits. The sacraments, in particular, presented specific difficulties. The requirement of genuine contrition and a firm purpose of amendment in confession meant that a man confessing the spiritual burden of his work, if he felt it as a burden, and if he had a confessor he trusted enough to speak to honestly about it, could not in conscience promise not to continue, because his continuation was not within his power to choose. He would do it again next month, because next month there would be a warrant and a condemned man and no one else to hold the axe. What absolution was available for a sin that was not finished, that was continuing, that would continue for as long as the man remained in the post? At death, and in Tudor England, death was never distant enough to be theoretical. The executioner faced the same hope and the same terror as everyone else, and carried it without the benefit of a community of people who understood what had made his particular life what it was. He would be buried in the churchyard of his parish, in the normal run of things, unless his death came too suddenly or too strangely for those arrangements to be made. His soul would go wherever souls went, and the account of his life would be made in whatever court was taking those accounts, and whether the work he had done was service to God's ordained order or participation in the murder of innocents, or both, or neither, was a question that would not be resolved on this side of death. He lived with it as best he could, and he prayed. One imagines he prayed, and the silence that came back was the same silence that comes back to everyone. The relationship between the Tudor executioner and the crowd that watched him work is one of the most revealing and most uncomfortable aspects of his professional life, because it was a relationship in which he was simultaneously the central figure of the performance and the most hated man in the audience's field of vision. It was a relationship that required him to perform under extreme pressure before thousands of people with complete expertise, and to receive in return something that was barely distinguishable from contempt. Public execution in Tudor England was not merely a punishment. It was a spectacle, a piece of civic theater, a public statement about power and order and the price of transgression against them. It was also, and this is the part that can be uncomfortable to acknowledge, entertainment in a social world that had very few competing forms of it. The great hanging days at Tyburn drew crowds that numbered in the tens of thousands, and those crowds came not solely out of moral satisfaction at the proper operation of justice. They came out of the same appetite for drama, for emotional intensity, for the experience of collective response that in a different era would fill theaters and cinemas and sports stadiums. They wanted to see something happen. They wanted to feel the particular energy of a large human crowd experiencing something significant together. The execution provided this reliably on a regular schedule, free of charge. The executioner was the person who made all of this happen. He was its most important performer in the practical sense, the one whose competence or incompetence determined whether the event was memorable or disastrous, whether the crowd went home satisfied or went home having witnessed something they would have preferred not to see. But he was not the hero of the spectacle. He was never the hero. The crowd's sympathy, almost always, was with the condemned. Even in cases where the condemned man was genuinely and widely despised, a murderer who had killed children, a traitor who had sold English secrets to enemies of the realm, the figure of the condemned person on the scaffold possessed an involuntary dignity, the dignity of the person whose fate is about to be decided, that the man standing over him with the axe or the rope could not share. The condemned was, in that moment, a human being at the extreme of human experience. The executioner was the mechanism by which the extreme was produced. Mechanisms do not attract sympathy. What mechanisms attract instead is contempt when they function badly and indifference when they function well. The executioner received the crowd's anger when things went wrong, swiftly and comprehensively and without mercy. If a hanging was prolonged and visibly agonizing, the crowd turned on the man who had tied the rope. If a beheading took multiple blows, the crowd jeered the axeman and did not bother to lower their voices while doing so. If the condemned died with particular grace and courage, as many did, having been coached by priests, sustained by faith, determined to make a death that would be witnessed and remembered and reported, the comparison with the working, sweating man on the scaffold was unflattering in ways that were completely visible to everyone present, including the executioner himself. The hissing and booing and verbal abuse that followed a badly managed execution was not merely aesthetic displeasure, it was also, in some cases, physically dangerous. There are accounts across the period of executioners being rushed by elements of the crowd after particularly botched executions, requiring rescue by the sheriff's men who were present specifically because they knew this could happen. There are accounts of executioners being followed home through the city streets and threatened in ways that went beyond words. The work was done in the most public space imaginable, before a jury of thousands, with no possibility of appeal against their verdict, no protection beyond whatever the sheriff's men could provide in the moment, and no recourse afterward. And yet the crowd also had, coexisting with its contempt, in a way that says something interesting about the complexity of human feeling, a fascinated and profound dependency on the executioner as a figure. He was the man who had handled death with his bare hands, repeatedly, professionally, over a period of years. He was the man who knew, in the most intimate and physical way possible, what dying looked like from the other side of the event. He possessed, in some diffuse but genuinely felt sense, a kind of terrible knowledge that no one else had, and that no one else particularly wanted, and that everyone, at some level, was curious about. The magical properties attributed to the hangman's rope, to his touch, to the bodies of the executed, were an expression of this. The condemned man's hand, rubbed against a tumor or a growth while the body was still warm, was supposed to cure it. The fat of executed criminals was rendered down and sold for healing purposes. The executioner controlled access to all of these things, and he was besieged by people seeking them in ways that created a specific kind of grubby, underground power in communities that believed in them, which is to say, in essentially all Tudor communities. The result was a relationship with the crowd that might be characterized as simultaneous revulsion and magnetic attraction. People did not want to know him socially, did not want to rent him good rooms, did not want to sit next to him in church, did not want their daughters to look at him twice. And they turned up, in their thousands, to watch him work. They booed him when he was clumsy, and then followed him home, hoping to buy a piece of his rope. They were, in all of this, recognizably human, expressing a very common human desire to have the benefits of a necessary system while maintaining a careful personal distance from the person who makes the system function. At this point in our story, it is worth pausing to speak not about the executioner in the abstract, but about specific individuals, the men whose names and stories survive, however patchily and imperfectly, from the Tudor period, and whose lives put something approaching human flesh on the bones of everything we have been discussing. The most famous name in Tudor and early Stuart execution is Richard Brandon, though he belongs more properly to the Stuart period, serving under James I and Charles I, and carrying out, most famously, the execution of King Charles I himself in 1649, a politically charged event of a kind even Tudor England had not quite produced. But his father, Gregory Brandon, served as common hangman of London through the reign of James I, and the family's professional presence stretched back into the Elizabethan period. The Brandons represent the closest thing Tudor and Stuart England produced to a dynasty of executioners. Not quite the formal hereditary system of the French Bourreau families, but a persistent family presence in the role over multiple decades, suggesting that a son who grew up with a father in the position found his own path into it through familiarity rather than desperate choice, which was perhaps the least terrible of the routes available. Going further back into the Tudor period proper, the men who carried out the executions that still catch the historical imagination are frustratingly difficult to name and document. The swordsman who beheaded Anne Boleyn in May 1536 is believed to have been a professional brought from Calais, since beheading by sword rather than the English axe was a technique more commonly practiced on the continent, and the axe that had severed previous heads was considered, by some accounts, too associated with common criminal execution for a queen. His name does not survive in any reliable document. He was paid, he performed his work with relative efficiency, he returned to France, and history has largely forgotten him. This is itself revealing. The historical record was made by people who did not think of the executioner as the kind of person worth naming, worth understanding, worth recording except as a fact of the event he participated in. A man named Derrick, who served as common hangman of London in the last years of Elizabeth I's reign, is one of the more substantial figures from the period's executioner history. Derrick's name has passed into the English language in a form that reflects his prominence in his own time. The word derrick, referring to a type of crane or hoisting apparatus, derives either from his name directly or from the type of gallows associated with him and his practice. The etymology is debated, but the survival of his name in this form suggests someone who was, in his working years, visible enough that his name attached to the tools of his trade in public memory and stayed there. Derrick had reportedly been condemned himself at some earlier point in his life. The record is unclear on specifics, and had saved himself by accepting the hangman's post, following the classic route into the profession we have already described. He served for years and carried out, by various accounts, a very large number of executions during a period when Elizabethan politics generated a steady supply of condemned traitors and criminals. He became, apparently, a recognized figure in London, not celebrated, not respected in any conventional sense, but known in the way that a city's distinctive permanent features become known. There, consistently, part of the landscape. A man named Bull appears in the records as the executioner who carried out the execution of Mary Queen of Scots at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire in February 1587, and whose performance on that occasion became one of the most widely reported and most unfortunately memorable episodes in the period's execution history. The execution of Mary was already, before it happened, a deeply politically fraught event. Elizabeth I had delayed signing the death warrant for months, oscillating between political necessity and personal reluctance, and when the warrant was finally signed and sent, Elizabeth would later claim she had not intended it to be dispatched immediately, a claim that satisfied no one and which was widely understood as covering herself against the international diplomatic consequences of executing a fellow anointed queen. Bull was brought from London to Fotheringhay specifically for the occasion. He arrived presumably as a reasonably experienced professional, not a novice, not someone untested. What happened on the scaffold that February morning was nonetheless a disaster of the kind that no amount of experience can entirely insure against, because execution is a physical process that depends on factors of geometry and force and the specific physical reality of the particular human body involved, and those factors cannot always be perfectly controlled. Bull's first blow struck badly, cutting into the back of Mary's head rather than across her neck. His second blow was closer, but still not clean. A third blow, used almost as a cutting rather than a striking motion, finally achieved the severance. The watching witnesses, a limited group given the sensitive political nature of the event, were horrified. The accounts they wrote and sent to their correspondents spread across Europe within weeks, adding a layer of grotesque incompetence to what was already a diplomatically explosive killing. Bull then lifted the head by the hair to display it, as was required, and Mary's wig, which no one present had been aware she was wearing, detached from the head and remained in his hand while the real head, short haired and gray, fell to the scaffold floor. He had to retrieve it and hold it up again while the assembled witnesses stood in silence. Bull returned to London afterward and continued in the role until his death. What he thought about that morning in Northamptonshire is not recorded. Whether it troubled him, whether he replayed it in the way that people replay catastrophic professional failures, whether he drank more than usual in the weeks that followed, these are questions the historical record does not answer. What the record does suggest, in its characteristic way, is that it was simply another day's work, handled as best he could, and that life went on. It always went on. These men, Derek, Bull, the unnamed swordsman at Anne Boleyn's execution, the unnamed man or men at the executions of Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, the Earls of Essex and of Northumberland, and all the others who died on Tudor scaffolds, represent a profession that was simultaneously the most visible work in the kingdom and the most invisible in the historical record. Their work was done in the most public spaces imaginable, before the largest gatherings of people in the cities of Tudor England, and they themselves are largely absent from the accounts those gatherings generated, present only as instruments of an event, rather than as people who had lives before and after it. In any profession, the consequences of error depend on the nature of the work and the visibility of the failure. A carpenter who makes a poor joint produces a piece of furniture that eventually wobbles, noticed gradually by relatively few people, with consequences proportionate to the failure. An executioner who makes a poor cut produces a spectacle of suffering witnessed simultaneously by thousands of people, in real time, in public, with no possibility of concealment or correction, and with consequences that can extend far beyond the immediate professional embarrassment to create genuine political and religious crises. We have already touched on the public humiliation that accompanied a badly managed execution, but the consequences could go considerably further than humiliation, and the history of the Tudor period contains several examples of failed executions that had consequences extending well beyond the scaffold. The execution of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, in May 1541 is one of the most notorious. The Countess was 67 years old, the oldest person executed under Henry VIII, a woman of considerable dignity and long royal connection who had spent the previous months imprisoned in the Tower under conditions that, by some accounts, had seriously damaged her health. She was condemned for treason through a bill of attainder that many observers found legally questionable. When she was brought to the block on a morning in May, the scene that followed was, by multiple contemporary accounts, though they vary in some specifics, prolonged and terrible. The executioner assigned to the task was young and reportedly inexperienced. His first blow, by most accounts, struck her shoulder rather than her neck. The Countess, still alive and bleeding, reportedly moved or rose. The executioner struck again and again and required multiple additional attempts. The accounts range from 3 to 11 blows, with the truth likely lying toward the lower end of that range, but certainly more than one, before death finally came. The watching crowd was horrified. Accounts of the scene spread rapidly through the court, through the city, and eventually to the European courts that were already watching Henry's treatment of his nobility with considerable unease. The consequence for the executioner who had done this is not something the record clearly documents, which is itself a kind of answer. A man whose catastrophic professional failure became associated with a major scandal of this kind was not likely to advance in the profession, was not likely to be selected for high profile commissions going forward, and might have found his continued employment in any form difficult to sustain. Whether he was dismissed, disciplined, replaced, or simply quietly shifted away from anything that would put him in front of a large audience again, we do not know. The silence of the record on the point suggests that he was not important enough to track. Mistakes could also create genuine legal jeopardy for the executioner. The legal framework within which he operated was extremely narrow, and its protections were conditional. The warrant he carried authorized him to kill a specific named person in a specific manner on a specific date under specific conditions. Any material deviation from those parameters removed the warrant's legal cover. If he carried out the execution before the warrant was legally in effect, or after it had expired, or in a manner not covered by its terms, or, in the most catastrophic scenario, on the wrong person, he had committed an act that no warrant could retrospectively justify. The legal protection that distinguished the executioner's work from simple killing was entirely dependent on strict compliance with documents that were the product of a legal system not always characterized by precision or care. There was also the physiological unpredictability of certain forms of execution that created situations the executioner had no good way to manage. The strangulation method of hanging did not always produce death on anything like a predictable timeline. A person who was unusually physically robust, or who had been given instructions by a sympathetic priest about how to position themselves to breathe more easily, or whose body simply responded to the reduction of oxygen differently than the average, might take considerably longer to die than the proceeding was supposed to take. The executioner, watching this happening on the scaffold above a crowd that was growing restless and vocal, had essentially no good options. He could pull on the legs, the traditional supplementary measure, well understood to hasten death by adding weight to the body, but this was completely visible to everyone watching and provoked its own immediate responses from the crowd, not all of them supportive. He could wait and endure the crowd's displeasure. He could attempt something else and have no legal justification for whatever he attempted. The situation was one in which the fundamental unreliability of the human body as a system for producing death on a schedule created professional difficulties that neither skill nor experience could entirely prevent. The crowd's response to any of these failures was immediate and could become dangerous. A crowd of tens of thousands in an era before effective crowd control had very few mechanisms preventing it from doing exactly what it wanted to do. When what it wanted to do was express its displeasure at an executioner who had just put a woman through 10 minutes of visible suffering before managing to kill her, the results could include rushing the scaffold, physical assault, and the kind of sustained threatening behavior that follows a person home through city streets. The sheriff's men present at executions were there in part because everyone involved knew this was a genuine possibility. It would be unfair and probably inaccurate to suggest that all Tudor executioners drank heavily. The documentary record is thin enough that blanket claims about any aspect of the individual lives of these men are difficult to sustain, but it would also be evasive to ignore the strong and persistent connection documented throughout the history of the profession, even when the Tudor era records are sparse, between the executioner's role and the consolations of alcohol. The connection is not difficult to understand. Here was a man doing work that required him to maintain a level of emotional detachment from what he was actually doing that most human beings are not naturally equipped to sustain. He was required to kill people calmly, professionally, repeatedly, in circumstances of maximum public scrutiny, without visible distress, without hesitation, without the kind of overt emotional response that the situation would naturally provoke in a person not trained or conditioned to suppress it. He was doing this work in a social context that told him consistently and at every level that he was a special category of person for whom such things were appropriate and natural and not the terrible imposition they would have been for an ordinary man. And he came home afterward to a house that his community regarded with unease, to a family that shared his stigma, to a social world that extended him, at best, a wary and contingent tolerance. Given all of this, the appeal of alcohol, its capacity to quiet the mind, to soften the edges of experiences that were in their raw form too sharp to hold comfortably, to make sleep possible in circumstances where sleep might otherwise have been elusive, seems not merely understandable, but almost predictable. And the records from various periods that touch on the drinking habits of executioners, while not uniform, suggest a pattern of men who spent meaningful portions of their income in taverns, who had complicated relationships with money as a result, and who relied on the particular sociability of the Tudor tavern in ways that went beyond simple thirst. The tavern occupied a specific and important place in the Tudor executioner's social world that it is worth understanding clearly. It was one of the very few social spaces in which economic standing and professional reputation were not the primary determinants of welcome. A tavern served whoever had money. A tavern's atmosphere, particularly in its busier and more anonymous establishments, offered a version of social participation that was unavailable elsewhere. The experience of being among people, of conversation, of a certain kind of warmth and noise and companionship, without the social accounting that all other forms of community required. Whether the executioner was known in his usual taverns varied. There are accounts of executioners who were recognized and even celebrated in specific establishments, men who became unofficial fixtures, trading on the dark celebrity of their profession, buying rounds for men who wanted to hear about the work from a safe social distance. There are presumably also accounts, unrecorded, of men who found establishments where they were not known, or where the custom of the house was to take money without asking too many questions, and who drank there in something closer to anonymity. The financial consequences of tavern-centered social life on an already irregular income were predictable. There are documented cases of executioners in serious debt. There are cases, extraordinary to contemplate, of executioners pawning the tools of their trade in order to raise immediate cash, and then being required to redeem them before the next scheduled execution, because there was no other axe, no other rope that would do. There are cases of men who had been paid generously for a high profile execution and who were in financial difficulty again within weeks, the money having moved from their hands to the hands of tavern keepers and moneylenders at a pace that reflected not merely poor financial management, but the structural problem of an income that arrived irregularly and in large amounts, and that provided no natural mechanism for the kind of steady, sustained accumulation that would have been required for real financial security. The private emotional life of these men is, in almost all cases, genuinely inaccessible to us, and we should be honest about that. The diaries and letters that survive from Tudor England were written overwhelmingly by the educated and the prosperous, and the executioner was almost always neither. What he felt about his work, whether it troubled him deeply, whether he had found ways to not think about it, whether the faces of the people he had killed visited him in dreams, whether there were specific executions he thought about for the rest of his life, whether there were others he had entirely forgotten, we cannot know. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that he was a human being doing work that required him to kill other human beings repeatedly, and that no human being does this without it leaving some kind of mark on who they are and how they move through the world. What kind of mark, and in what form that mark manifested in his daily life and his private self, is the kind of question that neither the historical record nor the psychology of the Tudor period was equipped to ask or answer. A Tudor executioner who survived to old age faced a retirement that offered essentially none of the comforts or securities we now associate with the end of a working life. But this was true, to some extent, of most people in Tudor England. Retirement was not a concept that existed in any institutionalized form for people below a certain level of wealth, and most people worked until they could not, and then were dependent on family or parish charity. For the executioner, however, even these minimal supports were complicated by the nature of what he had been and what he had done. There was no pension, in any sense of the word. There was no recognition from the civic or royal authority that had employed him. There was no ceremony of thanks, no acknowledgement that the years of service had been of value and were now concluded with honor. There was no guild that would maintain him in his old age, as guilds maintained retired members of more respectable crafts through their collective funds and their systems of mutual support. The day his employment ended, whether through his own incapacity, through the appointment of a successor, through changes in the civic structure that abolished the post or changed its terms, his salary stopped, and stopped without ceremony or supplement. What he then had was whatever he had managed to save, whatever family relationships had survived his professional life intact, and whatever claim he could make on the parish, poor relief that was, by the mid-16th century, becoming more systematically organized through the poor laws. The savings, as we have discussed, were often not much. The family relationships were complicated by years of transmitted stigma, and the parish relief was available in principle to those the parish recognized as its members in good standing, a recognition that the executioner's relationship with his parish had always been uneasy enough to make his eligibility for relief similarly uncertain. There are documented cases of aging executioners dying in poverty, buried in parish churchyards with minimal ceremony and with markers, wooden stakes in most cases, that rotted away within years, leaving no trace of the graves they had identified. There are cases of executioners whose deaths are recorded only in parish burial registers, a single line noting the name and the date, with no acknowledgement of what the man had been or what he had done. There are cases of men who spent the last years of their lives in conditions that were the logical end of everything their professional lives had been: marginalized, impoverished, without the social capital that would have allowed them to call on their community for the kind of support that community provided to people it actually valued. The question of the executioner's body itself after death had a certain dark irony about it. The man who had, for years, had charge of the bodies of others, who had determined what happened to them, who had facilitated their disposal, who had in some cases literally divided them into pieces for display, was himself at the end subject to whatever his community and his family could arrange for him, which was often very little. Whether he lay in consecrated ground, whether his grave was maintained, whether his name survived in any form beyond the thinning memories of his children, these were questions answered by the same social forces that had shaped the rest of his life. There is a particular kind of social position, not unique to the Tudor executioner, but exemplified by him with remarkable clarity, in which a person performs a function that society genuinely requires and simultaneously refuses to acknowledge. Every complex society has such positions in every era and every culture, though the specific forms they take vary. The people who clean the streets, the people who work in the places where animals become food, the people who manage the physical facts of death, the morticians, the grave diggers, the people who handle what we prefer not to handle ourselves. These roles share with the executioner's role the quality of being simultaneously necessary and honored primarily in the breach, doing work without which the society would not function, and receiving, in return, not gratitude, but a kind of collective avoidance. We need this done, and we will pay someone to do it, and we will not think too carefully about the person doing it. The Tudor executioner was the most extreme version of this pattern that the period produced, because his work was the most viscerally confronting. Killing people, deliberately in public, repeatedly, as a civic function, was something that the society required done and simultaneously needed to believe was done by a special category of person, someone whose willingness to do it placed him categorically outside the community of feeling that ordinary people shared. By constructing the executioner as a figure of dread and contamination, Tudor society absolved itself of the need to think too carefully about the fact that the killing was being done at all, and who it was being done to, and in whose name. The man on the scaffold was not doing something that ordinary people did. He was doing something that only he did, because of what he was, because of the dark and particular quality that set him apart from everyone else. He was a ritual figure as much as a working man, and ritual figures must be kept at arm's length from ordinary life, or the ritual loses its power to comfort. This was not a conscious or deliberate construction on the part of any particular person or institution. It was a collective social production maintained by thousands of individual decisions to not invite him to dinner, to not rent him the good room, to not sit next to him in church, that accumulated over time into a clearly defined social position with clearly defined limits and a clearly defined function. The function was to make state violence bearable for the people in whose name it was performed by directing whatever discomfort that violence generated onto the person who physically carried it out, rather than onto the society that had ordered it. The executioner, seeing this from the inside, saw it clearly. He saw that he was necessary and not honored. He saw that he was required and not wanted. He saw that the work the state asked him to do was work the state preferred to think of as his particular vice, rather than its own institutional decision. And he got up the next morning and went to work anyway, because that was what there was. What this says about Tudor society is complicated and not entirely flattering, but it is not entirely damning either, because the same pattern appears in every society we know anything about, in every period of history, without exception. Societies generate their own necessary discomforts and assign them to specific people who become, through the assignment, simultaneously valuable and invisible. The executioner was simply the most unambiguous version of this process. The role was the clearest possible case. The person was the most clearly marked. The social dynamics were the most legible. In looking at him clearly and honestly, we are looking at something that is not merely about Tudor England, but about the persistent human habit of needing things done that we do not want to acknowledge needing done. We have spent a long time discussing the Tudor executioner's life as a whole, its economic structure, its social dynamics, its spiritual complications, its physical demands, its personal costs. But let us close not with the abstract, but with something more specific. The last execution he personally carried out, whenever and however that came to be. Whatever the career had been, however many years it had lasted, however many commissions had been received, and warrants checked, and ropes tied, and axes lifted, there was a final one, a last morning when he checked the warrant for the last time, a last afternoon when he prepared the apparatus, a last scaffold where he took his place before a last crowd, a last condemned person who stood or knelt before him, and who may have spoken to him or may not, and who may have paid him or may not, and who died in whatever way the sentence required. After that last execution, he went home. He cleaned the tools, or put them away, or sat down with a drink, or sat in silence for a long time, in the way that people sometimes fall silent after something significant has ended, even if the ending was not acknowledged, and even if no one else noticed that it had. And then ordinary life continued, or what passed for ordinary life in his particular case, which had never been entirely ordinary, which had been shaped from the beginning by the work into something that did not fit the shape of an ordinary life. He still lived in the same house, in the same neighborhood, with the same neighbors who had always been wary. His children, if he had them, were still navigating the same complications his profession had created for them. His wife, if he had one, was still the wife of the man he had been, and was now the wife of the man he was becoming, whatever that turned out to mean. The priest, who had always been uncertain how to minister to him, was still uncertain. But the executions were done. Whatever account was to be made of what he had been, it was now complete. The scaffold had been his office, his stage, his arena, and now it would be someone else's. Someone else would stand there next time, with the same tools, and the same warrant, and the same crowd watching with the same complex and ungrateful fascination. And he was At the end of it, a man who had done a job that his society had required and had then done its best to pretend it had not required, performed by a man who had then done his best to pretend he had not performed it, which is the particular fiction that societies maintain in order to function without confronting themselves directly. He had done the work. He had been paid for it in the clothes of dead men and in pieces of rope and in coins pressed into his palm by people who could not look at him while they did it. He had lived with the knowledge of what he knew and the knowledge of how his community felt about him knowing it, and the knowledge of what his community felt about him for having known it. He had been necessary, and he had been invisible, and in the quiet of his last evening, without the scaffold before him, those two facts were the same fact, and he had always known it. There is one relationship we have not yet examined fully, and it may be the most human one in the whole strange ecology of the scaffold, the relationship between the executioner and the person he was about to kill. It was, in its way, one of the most intimate human relationships possible. Two people standing very close together, one of them about to end the life of the other, with full mutual knowledge of what was about to happen, and a shared, unspoken understanding of all that this moment contained. The conduct of that relationship was governed by custom and expectation, and the custom was, on its surface, a kind of formal courtesy. The executioner knelt before the condemned and asked their forgiveness. This was not a gesture imposed by law or by any written regulation. It was a custom practiced across the whole period and across many jurisdictions, reflecting the general Christian understanding that taking a human life, even a lawfully ordered one, was an act of sufficient gravity that some form of absolution was appropriate. The condemned person, equally by custom, granted the forgiveness. They might add words of their own, a prayer, a blessing, an expression of hope for the executioner's soul as well as for their own, and then the formality ended and the practical business began. What happened between the asking and the formal opening of the ceremony, in the minutes before the condemned knelt at the block or mounted the cart, varied by the specific people involved and the specific occasion. There are accounts of executioners and condemned persons having actual conversations in the period of preparation that were not merely ceremonial. The condemned, at this final extreme, sometimes spoke candidly about their lives, their regrets, their feelings, in ways that the presence of any other social figure would have inhibited. The executioner was a person who occupied a social role so marginal that the normal rules of social conversation did not quite apply to him in the usual way. The condemned, who had nothing left to lose, had passed beyond the point where those rules constrained them either. In the peculiar space between those two marginalized positions, something approaching genuine human contact was occasionally possible. There are accounts of executioners offering small kindnesses, a steadying hand, a quiet word of reassurance, the careful adjustment of a blindfold, or the precise arrangement of a hood so that it sat correctly and was not suffocating. There are accounts of condemned persons who spent their last minutes clearly visible by the testimony of witnesses in some kind of private communication with the man who was about to kill them, not in terror, not in rage, but in something more difficult to name. Whether those exchanges were consoling or terrible, or both, is not something the record usually tells us, and the record's silence is itself meaningful. The moment was too intimate for the official account, too human for the institutional narrative that execution documents were built to support. But it would be dishonest to idealize this, and the history contains accounts of the other kind as well. There are condemned persons who refused the executioner's formal request for forgiveness, who spat at him or cursed him, who went to their deaths with every available form of contempt directed at the man holding the axe. There are accounts of executions preceded by visible hostility between the parties, where the condemned's anger or the executioner's own visible distress created a tension that the watching crowd could read clearly. The formal script of forgiveness and preparation was a script, and scripts could be refused, and the refusal was itself a statement that the crowd registered and interpreted and reported. The condemned person's last speech, the speech from the scaffold, which was an expected and in some ways mandated part of the whole proceeding, was delivered in the executioner's physical presence, often only a few feet away. These speeches ranged from elaborate declarations of faith or political position, lasting half an hour or more, to brief and private, barely audible words addressed to no one in particular. The executioner listened to all of them. He heard every word of every final speech delivered on every scaffold he attended for the length of his career, which might be decades. He heard last prayers, last avowals of innocence, last confessions of guilt, last expressions of love for absent family members, last statements of theological conviction, last words that were so calm and composed that the crowd fell entirely silent, and last words that dissolved into grief or terror at the very end when composure failed. He heard all of this while standing at arm's length, waiting, which is itself a form of intimacy so particular that there is no word for it in ordinary language. What he made of it, over years and decades of accumulation, is something we cannot know, but it was part of what he was, in the deepest possible sense, and it set him apart from every other person in Tudor England who had not stood where he had stood, and heard what he had heard, and known what those last words contained. Throughout this long evening, we have been describing the executioner's relationship with his community, largely from the outside, the social dynamics, the theological positions, the general pattern of avoidance and exploitation. But it is worth pausing to ask, as concretely as the limited record allows, what the daily texture of his life actually looked like in the neighborhood where he lived. The surviving record is thin, as we have established throughout. The executioner was not, by and large, the kind of person about whom educated tutors wrote extensively in their diaries and letters. But there are fragments. There are records of civic disputes involving executioners. There are depositions in which neighbors gave evidence about incidents involving the man who held the hangman's post. There are wills in which the executioner appears as a witness or a creditor or a debtor, which tells us something about the texture of his social world, and parish records that note his presence or his absence from the basic rituals of community life. From these fragments, a picture emerges that is less extreme than the mythology in both directions. The Tudor executioner was not a total social outcast. He was not, literally, unable to conduct transactions, to buy food, to speak with shopkeepers and neighbors, and the people he passed in the street every morning on his way to wherever he was going. He was embedded, in his way, in the social fabric of his neighborhood, attending church, paying rent, being recognized in the taverns and alehouses he frequented, known by name to the stallholders in the nearby market. The social exclusion was real, but not absolute. It was more accurate to describe it as a persistent and pervasive discount on all forms of social standing, a subtle and consistent devaluation that operated across every interaction rather than a wall that separated him completely from all ordinary human contact. He was, in many practical respects, simply a familiar and somewhat uncomfortable feature of the neighborhood, in the way that certain establishments and certain figures become features of a neighborhood through years of persistent presence, known without being fully integrated, acknowledged without being warmly welcomed. Children in the streets near his house knew who he was. Shopkeepers recognized him and served him, if perhaps with slightly less warmth than they served other regular customers. The landlord of his usual tavern poured his drink and took his money and may have engaged him in conversation or may not, depending on the landlord and the evening and the mood and the presence or absence of other customers whose opinions needed managing. His neighbors spoke about him among themselves in ways that the record only indirectly reflects. They noted his comings and goings on execution days because his departure from the neighborhood in the morning carrying certain equipment was a visible and unmistakable indication that something was scheduled, and his return in the afternoon was the visible evidence that it was concluded. They remarked on the business of the rope and the tools and the periodic arrivals and departures that execution work required. They discussed, in the way that neighborhoods discuss the unusual features of their own landscapes, what he was like as a person, what he did, and whether it seemed to trouble him, whether he was a good or a bad sort in the ways that neighborhoods have always applied those categories with a thoroughness that has nothing to do with formal moral philosophy. Some were, by all the human evidence, kind to him in small ways, the kindness that people extend to their neighbors when the neighborhood is the primary social world and relationships within it need to be managed with some attention to the long term. Others were hostile in the ways that recorded disputes and complaints reflect. Most were probably neither consistently one nor the other, but simply responsive to the specific circumstances of each interaction in the way that most human social behavior actually operates when it is not being described from the outside. What they all shared, the kind and the hostile and the indifferent, was the awareness of what he did and the consciousness that his presence in their neighborhood was not a presence any of them would have chosen if other arrangements had been available. That awareness shaped every interaction, however small and practical, in ways that were rarely explicit and almost always felt by everyone involved. He was a man who lived in a particular kind of visibility and a particular kind of invisibility simultaneously, seen everywhere he went and genuinely looked at almost nowhere. That combination, present and not quite acknowledged, necessary and not honored, human and not entirely treated as fully human in the social sense, was the texture of his daily life, as ordinary as bread and as persistent as weather, and it did not diminish because he had lived with it for years. It simply became part of what the world was, and he moved through it as people move through what the world is, because there is no other way. He ate. He sat by the fire in the evenings. He slept, or tried to, in the way that tired people sleep, when the tiredness is not simple, but weighted with things that do not resolve themselves in the dark. In the morning, the city began again, and he was part of it in the way he had always been part of it, present and necessary and not quite belonging, which is in the end a particular kind of belonging, and one that many more people than we usually acknowledge have had to make do with. Let me leave you with one last image. It is an ordinary image, not a dramatic one, because the ordinary images are the ones that stay. Picture a man walking home through the streets of Tudor London on an evening in the middle of the 16th century. He is not walking particularly quickly or slowly. He is wearing ordinary clothes, nothing that marks him out, no uniform, no badge. The work is behind him. The crowd has dispersed. The scaffold is empty. The city is doing what cities do in the evening, closing up, eating, arguing, making love, nursing the sick, putting children to bed, arguing about theology in back rooms of taverns, sleeping, dreaming. He walks through this, separate from it, of it and not of it, the way he has always been separate and of it at the same time. He knows this city's rhythms in a way very few people do. He has been present at some of its most extreme and most public moments, standing at the place where law became physical fact, where the state's authority became the reality of a rope or an axe. He has done this over and over, in rain and in heat, before friendly crowds and hostile ones, for good money and for nearly nothing, for condemned people who thanked him, and for condemned people who cursed him, and for condemned people who said nothing at all. He is tired. He is tired in the specific way of a person who has done demanding physical work that is also emotionally demanding, and that cannot be discussed openly with anyone who has not done it, which is essentially everyone. He is tired in the way of a person who has been looked at all day in a specific way that is not quite looking at a person. He is going home. He will eat something. He will sleep or try to. Tomorrow will come or it will not, but in either case, there is nothing more to do tonight. We owe him, I think, this much, to have looked at him clearly for a little while, without the mythologies and without the condemnation, to have seen him as the thing he was, a human being doing difficult work in circumstances not of his choosing, for a society that needed what he provided and preferred not to think about him when he was not providing it. That is not heroism. It is not villainy. It is the ordinary complexity of an ordinary, extraordinary life, lived in one of history's stranger corners by a man whose name, in most cases, we will never know. That is why it sucked to be a Tudor executioner. And the reason it sucked is not entirely about Tudor England. The reason it sucked is about what happens when a society decides that something needs doing and that the person doing it does not need honoring. That decision is not unique to Tudor England. It is not unique to any period or any place. It is one of the persistent habits of organized human life, and recognizing it in the figure of the Tudor executioner is perhaps a small step toward recognizing it in the less obvious places where it operates today. Rest now. The city is quiet. The scaffold is empty. The long work is done. You stayed with me all the way to the end, and I am glad of it. I hope some of what we walked through tonight finds its way into your dreams in the gentler sense, not the dark parts, but the human ones, the man walking home, the city going quiet, the fire banked for the night. If drowsy history has helped you sleep, even once, the quietest and kindest thing you can do is subscribe so these slow histories keep finding the people who need them. It takes a moment, and it means more than you might expect to the channel's ability to keep growing. And leave a comment when you wake. Just let me know where you were listening from and what the time was. I will read it, probably with something warm, and I will be glad you were here. For now, rest. The scaffold is empty. The crowd has all gone home. Somewhere in Tudor London, the city is settling into the long quiet of the night, and you are safe, and you are warm, and there is nothing more that needs doing until morning. Good night,